I'd like to welcome you all to the fourth of the Alternative Form of Knowledge Construction lecture series. This is the fourth year that it's been held, and this is the first time we've had one of the lectures at PCC. I'm Ann Sinnemer. I'm a mathematics teacher here, and I've been working with Shapna Mukhopadhyay. She's really the prime mover of this lecture series. So welcome. It's nice to see so many people here. And I'm going to ask Algie Gatewood to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. I am very happy that we have this distinguished faculty member from the University of Illinois at Chicago, because in today's economy, it is imperative that we have strong mathematics backgrounds. And the fact that he has come up with a strategy, if you will, to impart among African American students, Native American students, Latinos, and other students with minimum resources is just awesome, and I'm so happy about that. I understand that in addition to his teaching at the university, he has 15 years experience teaching community college students, so he really gets it when it comes to community college students. To make this really brief, in talking with a colleague just a few minutes ago, she came to me and said, Dr. Martin is a bomb. I got excited. I said, I heard we had some shootings not so far from here recently, but I don't know about a bomb. She said, that's a good thing. So I'm really happy to have Dr. Martin here, and I'm very appreciative of the work that Ann Sinnemer is doing to enhance the teaching and learning of mathematics on this campus. Ann Sinnemer is a bomb, too, so keep that in mind. Dr. Martin, thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear okay? Okay. I just came out of a very engaging discussion with some students and faculty members, and I'm hoping that I can match some of that enthusiasm that was in that discussion. So if I seem like I've lost a bit of my thunder, I hope not. I'll try to be the bomb, as someone said. Thank you for inviting me. I know that this is the fourth talk, I believe, in the series on alternative forms of knowledge construction. And what I want to do today is a couple of things. I want to talk about sort of the truth, because this came up in the previous discussion, as I see it. The truth on a set of issues that are very near and dear to me, that I'm very passionate about, and I think that passion will come through in my presentation. I also said in the previous discussion that when I give this talk, and it's an old talk, but I think it's still fairly relevant, I don't give the talk to make people feel comfortable, leave the room happy necessarily, in the best of spirits, but I don't also give it to make people feel sad or depressed. There's probably one word in the title of my talk which probably generated the most attention, and I think anytime that word is used, people are not sure what the discussion will entail. So I will be talking about issues of race and identity in the context of math education. And so I should probably start off with a couple of disclaimers. And the first is I'm not a sociologist, although I will sound like one, and it looks like I'm playing one on TV. I am not a sociologist. I taught math for 15 years in the California Community College context. Most of my training is in mathematics and physics, and I've taught enough content, mathematical content, to know that content is not the be-all and the end-all in discussions around learning and participation. Context also matters. So most of my comments today will be about the context of mathematics learning and participation for African American students. However, I think the discussion moves much farther beyond those students to other student groups as well. So although it may seem that I'm very narrow and focused and that my passion is confined to one group of students, I'm really concerned with all students experiencing mathematics learning and participation in meaningful ways. But the contents of my talk will be very, very focused today. And I should also thank you again for inviting me, particularly to Ann and Shapna, for asking me to come and be a part of the series. And I'm always very, very happy to come and talk about my work. And I hope that the comments will generate meaningful discussion at the end. I want to situate my work and my own worldview, if you will, in the context of a few turns in math education research. And I won't try to, have the vast majority of my comments be inaccessible, in the ether. I really want to sort of bring this down to where the rubber hits the road about halfway through the talk. The first part of the talk will be focused on some of the ideas, the big ideas that I tend to focus on in my work, in my teaching, my practice, my policy advocacy, my policy critique, my research critiques as well. And it'll give you a sense of the language and the way that I frame the issues and how I see the world in the way that I do. About midway through, I'll talk a little bit about my background in terms of the kind of work that I've done, where I've taught, and how I've gotten to this point in my career in terms of how I see the world, again, in terms of math learning and participation for many students. And then at the end, if we have time, and I'm thinking that we will, I will try to give you some data from real students where, for them, I'm using that phrase again, the rubber hits the road. So you will see how some of this theory that I talk about in the beginning, or principles or concepts, how that really maps out into real people's real lives. And I think that's where the most impactful part of the talk will occur, although I think the first part is pretty exciting as well. So there have been a number of turns in math education in terms of looking at student learning, teaching, curriculum development, assessment, et cetera, and they have names that we all recognize or that we can somewhat identify with in different ways: behaviorist, cognitivist, constructivist, social political, social cultural, et cetera. And these all mean different things to different people, but they represent sort of movements, social movements, if you will, within the field to signify our best thinking on how we conceptualize what students do as they go about learning mathematics and experiencing the teaching of mathematics. So the very last one on the list is the social political turn. It's the turn where critical math educators such as myself and my colleague last week, Rico Gutstein, who was here giving a talk, I believe, at the other campus, talk about issues of social justice, race, identity, et cetera, et cetera. However, I would situate myself in that last turn probably on an extreme end because of the way that I talk about race and because of my advocacy for attention to race when we're talking about mathematics content. So I don't want anyone to interpret me as kind of this lone wolf, sort of yelling, and I get a number of interesting kinds of feedback to the things that I say and my perspective, and they say, well, is it possible that many other people could actually believe what he believes, and is there anyone else arguing this? I don't think I'm alone, but even if I were alone, I think the message is important enough for someone to deliver it, and I'm happy that it happens to be me today. So what is my main argument today, or what are my main arguments today? I'm going to sort of read these out loud just to make sure that they're from my mouth to your ears and that there's no misunderstanding about what it is that I'm trying to argue in the subsequent panels. So race and identity are centrally important but inadequately and poorly studied considerations in mathematics learning and participation for all students. Okay? Although my comments today will focus on African American learners, I think this is true for all students. Unfortunately, we don't do a very good job of raising these issues and studying them either from a research or policy perspective. In a society where race and identity figure so prominently in people's everyday lives, mathematics learning and participation can be and should be, I would argue, conceptualized as racialized forms of experience. And I'll explain what that means again in subsequent slides. Essentially what this gets at, and I'll scratch at the surface here, is that mathematics learning and participation, they're structured by the dominant ideologies and relations of race that exist in the larger society. Another way to think about this is that because students enter the mathematics classroom, issues of race and identity don't stop at the mathematics classroom door. Those things play themselves out every day, every hour, every minute in students' lives, in teachers' lives, in administrators' lives, et cetera, whether we admit it or not. And I want to make some of this clear today. And then third, given that this is a knowledge construction series, I wanted to make the point that there is a need to liberate the production of knowledge about African American learners in mathematics. Most of what we know about African American children in mathematics is not very informative, I would say. This is just my own personal view. It tells us a few things, but in terms of meaningful change, meaningful outcomes for these students, and meaningful experiences, most of what we know is not as informative as I think it could be or it should be. Okay? So these are going to be my points wrapped in other kinds of dialogue that I'll go through. So the first question is, again, if you pay attention to the title and you say, well, gee, he's going to be talking about race and mathematics at the same time, do race and identity really matter? Why raise these issues in the context of something that would seem so objective, so indisputable, so factual, et cetera? Why bring these issues up? Well, contrary to popular belief, and someone asked me this question, do you think things are going to change now that Obama's president? So I would say, contrary to popular belief, we do not live in a post-racial society. Race, as a social construct, as a social political construct, is recreated and reconfigured in relation to the conditions of the current social political and geopolitical context. Okay? So race changes. It's adaptive, it's permanent, is one of the arguments that I would make. So the fact that I'm talking about it is not talking about it to get rid of it, but to deal with it, understand it, and also to understand one of its manifestations, which is racism. So although race may not be real, psychologically or any other way, racism is real and it has real consequences. And so are processes that I'll talk about, like racialization, etc. So race is not going anywhere. It's here. We're going to deal with it forever. And that's not a pessimistic attitude. That's more of a racial realist attitude. The next point, let's take reality number one. This comes from studies done by psychologists at the University of Michigan who study racial identity. And they make the point here that as a result of their experiences with oppression in the society, the concept of race has played a major role in the lives of African Americans. Although race has dubious value as a scientific classification system, it has had real consequences for the life experiences and life opportunities of African Americans in the United States. And I think most of us can, at least on the surface, accept that and kind of believe it, even if we think that we've entered into a new phase where we consider race to be no longer an issue. I think most people have a sense of history and are willing to acknowledge this to some degree. Now, I've extended this statement and changed it slightly. And I'm not going to take credit for this. I think it still is an outcome of the first set of authors' statement, but I'm going to change it in this way. As a result of their consequences with oppression and power in this society, the concept of race has historically played a major role in the lives of all Americans. Although race has dubious value as a scientific classification system, it has real consequences for the life experiences and life opportunities of all racially defined groups in the United States. Okay? So part of the argument that I'm going to make, although my focus is on African American learners, is that my discussion actually applies to all students in all settings, in all classrooms, in the context of mathematics learning. So all students will experience math learning and participation through the lens of race. And I can make that argument, I think, very cogently. Okay, now what about in math education? So we got the societal view on the slide before this. What about in math education? How do math education scholars and how have they dealt with this concept, this idea of race in their work? And this is from a paper that I wrote called Researching Race in Math Education, and I'll give a reference for it at the end. This statement says, within math education, race remains under-theorized in relation to mathematics learning and participation, while race is characterized in the sociological and critical theory literatures as socially and politically constructed with structural expressions. Most studies of differential outcomes in mathematics education began and end their analysis with static racial categories and group labels for the sole purpose of disaggregating data. We create racial groups, we perform the analysis, and at the end, we see differences among those groups, and we say that the results are due to race. And I think that's a faulty approach. One consequence is a widely accepted and largely uncontested racial hierarchy of mathematical ability. Okay, if you go out in the streets, you ask the common person, the average person, who's good in math? They will give you sort of a rank ordering of socially identified groups and say, well, we tend to put, quote unquote, Asian students here, white students near the top, then we sort of work our way down the pecking order, the hierarchy, and eventually we get to the students that we locate at the bottom of this hierarchy. Typically African American, Latino, Native American, and some poor students. Okay, so there's sort of a natural discursive orientation and also conceptual orientation to thinking about the fact that mathematics has a way of sort of revealing ability among particularly defined social groups, and that is somehow objective. That there are some students here, there are some students here, there are some students at the bottom, and that's the way it is. And it's due to race, whatever that might mean in that particular person's conceptualization. So one consequence, as I said, is a racial hierarchy of mathematical ability. Now, rather than challenging and deconstructing this hierarchy, many math educators take it as their natural starting point. Disparities in achievement and persistence are then framed as reflecting race effects rather than as consequences of the racialized nature of students' mathematical experiences. Now, that's kind of a deep, dense statement on race, but I'll unpack it in some of the subsequent slides, and you'll get a sense of what I'm getting at in terms of how people really deal with it. The most pernicious example, just to sort of ad-lib here a little bit, is the racial achievement gap that many of you have heard about. What I'm claiming is that based on test score outcomes, we construct this hierarchy, we tend to assume that it's real. And what we are doing when we make those assumptions is that we are actually assigning identities to particular groups of students. So we identify students as high achievers, low achievers, et cetera, and we tend to align that with the racial categories that we've created. So to be African American essentially is to be a low achiever. To be Asian American is to be good at math. Okay, so there's this juxtaposition of how we take the concept of race and overlay it and juxtapose it with concepts like ability and literacy, et cetera, et cetera. And this is very, very common in math education, to create racial categories, to put people in those categories, to perform the analysis, get the outcomes, and then say that the outcomes are due to race. Now, what's very interesting about this research and policy is that in most of these studies, race is never defined. So I could pick up some of the leading math ed journals and I could raise the question, well, what does a white student really mean in this study? Okay, if we go with social categories as a representation of race. It's never defined. I've never seen a study in math education that's defined for me a white student. In fact, I've never seen a study that defines a black student. And so to talk about a black-white racial achievement gap based on concepts that you haven't defined makes very little sense. And we also know that we could reconstruct the categories and we could reconstruct the outcomes and we would get different outcomes. We wouldn't explain it in the same way. So for example, again, ad-libbing a little bit here, if black students tomorrow outperformed white students, we wouldn't call it a racial achievement gap. We wouldn't say that there are pathologies and family background issues with white students because black students are outperforming them in these particular measures. We would come up with something else. So I think race is created, it's constructed, it's recreated, it's reconstructed according to particular kinds of purposes, et cetera. And I think mathematics education is guilty of that as well. So it's kind of a pessimistic statement, but it's one that I typically believe in. Now, defining my terms. So there's very clear, as I invoke some of these in the actual narratives that I'll show you later, what I'm getting at. I'll make sure that I'm defining my terms very clearly, and questions can be raised at the end, obviously, about my definitions. Okay, race. Okay, typically we think of race in terms of phenotype, biology, genetics, et cetera, but we all know, hopefully we know, that race is a social political construction. Okay, it's a social construction, and it's constructed and it's, again, destroyed. Racial categories are destroyed, they're created, they're recreated for particular purposes. The example that I gave in the previous discussion is how black as a social category was recreated post 9/11, post 9/11. Okay? So socially identified groups, Middle Eastern, Arab Americans, for example, were then blackened in society. They were relocated in that particular space that we define as what it means to be black. And then we know that our conception of black in U.S. society has a number of negative connotations. And so we actually recreated race in the moment, and many lay people didn't really consider that. We sort of got swept up in the moment, we took off from that point, and we accepted the fact that one group in society was now sort of repositioned in a different kind of hierarchy in a particular way, in a negative way. So race is actually an ideological construction and not just a social construction, because the idea of race has never existed outside a framework of group interest. As a part of a 19th century pseudoscientific theory, as well as in contemporary popular thinking, the notion of race is inherently part of a model of asymmetrically organized races in which whites rank higher than non-whites. Furthermore, racism is a structure because racial and ethnic dominance exists in and is reproduced by the system through the formulation and applications of rules, laws, and regulations, and through access to and the allocation of resources. Okay, so it's systemic, it's structural. Finally, racism is a process because structures and ideologies do not exist outside the everyday practices through which they are created and confirmed. These practices both adapt to and themselves contribute to changing social, economic, and political conditions in society. So race is a complex phenomenon, although it's treated very simply in most of the math ed research. Okay? And it gets even more complex when you turn to individuals and ask them to then talk about their racialized forms of experience, which I'll get to in a second. Racialization is another word that I'll use, so there's going to be a series of definitions here, and again, this is just for conceptual clarity before we get to some of the data. Racialization is a term that's coined by Robert Miles. It refers to any process or situation wherein the idea of race is introduced to define and give meaning to some particular population, its characteristics, and its actions. So again, in a very, very real context, the notion of a racial achievement gap. To frame achievement differences as one of being racial achievement differences says that we're giving meaning to what it means to be black, what it means to be white, what it means to be other. Okay? Because we locate students in particular ways relative to each other. So when we talk about the racial achievement gap, and we start to, as I said in the previous, again, as we start to run with that notion, and we operate based on the idea that there is something called a racial achievement gap, our actions are then determined. We have to sort of proceed in particular ways because we want to, at the end of the day, as you all know, close the racial achievement gap. Now look how the racialization process plays out here, for example, in this particular example. Closing the racial achievement gap then implies that we need to move African American black students from where they are to where white students are. So we've given value to the social label of white, and we've denigrated and oppressed the social label of black. So in that moment, in that instant, we've recreated race. We've given meaning to what we mean by race in particular groups within these social categories. Okay? So racialization is key to what I'll be talking about as well. Now, what am I getting when I talk about racialized constructions of mathematical literacy or racialized mathematical experiences? I want to give you two examples of how policymakers have in the past and how they are currently dealing with race in very, very problematic ways. One statement, the longest statement, is from a report in the early 1980s, and the other is a statement that's being proliferated right now around the country in many different policy reports to characterize black and white students. The first statement is very, very frightening because what it does actually takes the concept of mathematical literacy, the concepts of mathematical literacy and illiteracy, and it aligns those concepts with the social categories that we've created for particular groups. And so it actually assigns, in terms of an identity, a group identity, particular kinds of abilities to one group versus another group. And groups are positioned relative to each other in this hierarchy that I talk about. And so I'm trying to expose this as sort of a precursor to getting to some more on-the-ground things with students. So apart from economics, the social and political consequences of mathematical illiteracy provide alarming signals for the survival of democracy in America. Because mathematics holds the key to leadership in our information-based society, the widening gap between those who are mathematically literate and those who are not coincides to a frightening degree with racial and economic categories. There's a correspondence there that is assumed here. We are at risk of becoming a divided nation in which knowledge of mathematics supports a productive, technological, powerful elite, while a dependent, semi-literate majority, disproportionately Hispanic and black, find economic and political power beyond reach. Unless corrected, innumeracy and illiteracy will drive America apart. Okay? So my point in presenting that statement is to show you how, in math ed, we are a contributor, again, to how these racial categories are defined and how race is defined, and we do it in particularly pernicious ways. So what this statement for me does, and you may have a different interpretation, but what this statement for me does, it takes these social labels like black and white, it takes these also very important notions about literacy and illiteracy, mathematical literacy, and it aligns them in particular ways. It juxtaposes this imagined or real, if you want to take it that way, this imagined or real productive part of society, and it says that these are folks who are literate, and then it takes this other portion of society that says these are folks who are illiterate, and then it goes on to say this aligns with racial categories. Okay? This aligns with racial categories. The second statement, and you can think about that and see how that actually plays out. The second statement is much more simple, but it cuts to the heart of the matter, and it says African American 12th graders demonstrate mathematics skills and abilities at the level of white 8th graders. Preposterous statement, but one that many teachers have been asked to accept, many policymakers take up and they run with it. Many administrators take up and run with it, and they think that they have proof for something of this nature. And for me, this is preposterous. I've never seen proof of this since I've been a math educator. However, it's touted as so. And again, these are racialized constructions. The idea that race, the concept of race, is introduced to give meaning to some particular group, its actions, etc. And we can see the clear alignment here of meanings with particular social categories. I also want to talk a little bit about identity, because I'm going to be throwing these in as I, again, talk about these narratives. So for me, identity has to do with the social and narrative construction of the self in the world in relation to others historically and contemporarily. Who we are. Let me sort of do another ad lib here. How many people in the room play the violin? By show of hands. How many play the violin? How many of you are violinists? Okay. Those are two different questions. Okay, those are two different questions. They are related, okay, to some degree, but one doesn't imply the other in either direction. Okay, you could argue. I think, well, in one direction. So someone who assumes the identity of a violinist assumes certain dispositions. They can demonstrate certain skills. They can assert themselves as a violinist, and they can probably back that up. Someone who plays the violin, on the other hand, may not want to proclaim that they are a violinist because of dispositions, skills, et cetera, et cetera. So what we say about ourselves and what we can demonstrate in how we perform and what others say about us are very important considerations. And I'm going to take this notion, and I'm actually going to run with this in combination with my comments about race to show you how these things converge in real people's lives where issues of race are inescapable, issues of identity are inescapable, and that they emerge as centrally important in how people go about learning and participating in this area that we call math education, teaching and learning, et cetera. Identity is also going to be multidimensional and co-constructed. So a particular focus of mine is how do people construct their identities as African American, whatever that might mean, and it's going to be diverse across individuals. And at the same time, how do they construct their identities as people who do mathematics, what I call a mathematics identity? How do these two identities come together, or in some cases diverge, so that your investment in one precludes an investment in the other? Or how does your investment in one necessitate an investment in the other? How do these identities get co-constructed? The most obvious example from the literature, at least, is the idea of gender and mathematics, where women are socialized and led to believe that because of their identity as women, that they can or cannot do mathematics. In most cases, it cannot. So these identity issues emerge as centrally important as well in a conversation about race. Now, these identities are negotiated and performed against the backdrop of power relations. In my particular case, race relations and how these race relations play out in societal context, and I claim that they don't end at the mathematics classroom door. Okay? They socially locate in terms of margin and center, and you can imagine participating in mathematics as kind of a cultural activity, and the things that we do are part of the practices, how you do mathematics, and you might be someone who is not so central to the practice because you've been marginalized, because maybe you're a newcomer. And so how we make our way from the periphery of these practices, whether they be classroom or institutional, how we make our way from the periphery to the center is about power relations. Some people are not allowed to make their way to the center of the practice. Some people are pushed away from the center of the practice. Some people are socialized in, some people are socialized out. And we all know examples in our own experiences, for example, where we see people or we've experienced being socialized out of mathematics. Okay, there are many, many examples probably in this room of people who were told directly or indirectly through different kinds of messaging, different kinds of framings, that you are not someone who does mathematics, or people like you don't do mathematics. Okay, these examples emerge over and over and over and over and over again. Identity is fluid and it's always under construction. So an identity is not fixed, although there may be some very, very persistent aspects, it's not fixed. We can mold and shape identities, particularly for students who are trying to learn. We can shape these in particular ways so that students can take on the kind of identities that we hope, both on the racial identity side and perhaps on the academic and mathematical side, so that these two can be joined in unison and we can get students who actually see themselves as fully capable of doing this, engaging in these particular kinds of activities. And it's also linked to learning. As you learn, your identity changes. As your identity changes, you're more motivated to learn. And you can think about any kind of activity that's meaningful for you, whether you're a gamer, whether you're a skateboarder, whether you're a violinist, whether you're a basketball player, your identity will shape how you engage in the practice and how you engage in the process of learning. And it will sort of determine what learning is for you. Okay? So I want us to keep that on the board as well. Racial identity in particular, I think this is where we're getting closer and closer again to as I said, the rubber hits the road. So racial identity, just to be very specific about what it is, it refers to the significance and qualitative meaning that individuals attribute to their membership within particular racial groups within their overall self-concepts. Okay? So what does it mean for me, for example, to be African American? It may be very different from another member in the audience who was also identifying as African American. This will play out very differently. But for me, the interest is how do we define this and what does it mean? There's two components. There's the assigned identities component in terms of what people say, and then there's the asserted identities in terms of what we say, and then there's a negotiation that happens between the two. Now, in the specific example of school context, most assessments of skill and ability narrowly construct and portray African American students as mathematically at risk and unsuccessful. The policy documents, the statements that I referred to a second ago, give an example of that. These assignments simultaneously construct white and Asian students and their performance as normative. Okay? So the goal is to have, for example, the low achievers, the students that we tend to label in that way, African American, Latino, Native American, poor students, match the high achievers. Okay? And again, because this is broken out along socially defined racial categories, we get more meanings for race. And then the asserted identities is, what does it mean from the point of view of African American students to be African American on one hand and doers of mathematics on the other? Okay? What do real people who socially identify as African American have to say about these two kinds of identities, and how do they come together? It raises some interesting issues and some interesting questions that we could follow up. Now, one of my contributions as a scholar, sort of as a researcher, although I have a number of years of community college teaching, is to sort of bring these issues together in the context of math ed and talk about something that's called a mathematics identity. You all have them in the room. They've been shaped. They're continually shaped. In the meeting, again, that we had about an hour ago, some of the people in the room talked about their own traumatic experiences and how, as learners, they still struggle with the idea of who am I relative to this discipline? You know, what can I do? Am I capable, et cetera? So mathematics identity encompasses the dispositions and deeply held beliefs that individuals develop about their ability to participate and perform effectively in mathematical context and to use mathematics to change the conditions of their lives. So these are not just hot emotions that sort of come and go because you had a bad day. These are deeply held beliefs. Just as you invest in your sense of self, for example, as a basketball player, as a woman, as a violinist, I'm claiming that people invest deeply in themselves as learners of mathematics as well. Now, how do these identities sort of come out so that we can observe them? A math identity encompasses two things: a person's self-understandings, as well as how they're constructed by others in the context of doing math. And so an identity is expressed in narrative form, at least for me, as a negotiated self, a negotiation between our own assertions and the external descriptions of others. Math identities, as I said, in general, are always under construction. Okay? Mathematics socialization. How does this happen? How do people generate their identities, and what are the experiences that lead to this? So I've used the phrase mathematics socialization to capture this. Some of you can link this to gender socialization. You can link this to academic socialization. Same concept. And the definition is there. You can sort of quickly scan through that. Now, I want to get to the crux of the matter here about this mathematics learning and participation as racialized forms of experience. How does this sort of come together when we put all this together? And I'm going to talk about African American learners' experience in particular. And I know that African American learners are very diverse and broad, but there's some collective experiences that seem to emerge over and over and over. And there's two things that I found over the course of my teaching, my research, and my policy work in terms of advocating and critiquing policy, is that African American students, and I think you get a glimpse of this already, are typically constructed as mathematically illiterate and change-worthy. The illiterate part is pretty clear in terms of how the literature does this. The change-worthy part comes in because what we are saying is that African American students need to be less black, and this is controversial, they need to be less black, and they need to be more like other. And you fill in the blank in terms of what's given priority and preference in terms of where these students' achievements should be. So they should somehow give up aspects of their identity in order to be high achievers, because their current situation and status as being black is associated with being a low achiever. Okay? So there's some very, very interesting things there in terms of how these students are racialized and how their experiences are racialized and what they're asked to give up, what they're asked to consider, and what they're asked to struggle against in this arena. Their social devaluing and subsequent treatment makes African American status a particularly salient marker for learning and participation. This social devaluation, especially in relation to teacher practice and teacher beliefs, can influence the formation of identities of participation and non-participation among African Americans. Okay? So what I'm claiming there, and I'm not blaming teachers, I'm saying teachers are one part of the puzzle here in terms of understanding some of the outcomes that we all consider to be problematic, but we really don't have really good answers for. So why is it that we see these particular kinds of trends and patterns among African American children trying to learn mathematics? And I'm claiming that teachers play a significant role in helping students develop identities as either doers or non-doers, participants or non-participants in this arena. Okay? And I can demonstrate, I can document this. If you don't believe me, you will believe the people who tell you so for fact, for their truth. Now, that's kind of my conceptual apparatus, if you will, the theory that I use, the sort of ivory tower notions. So who am I and sort of how did I get to this point to sort of bring all this to the table? Well, it's based on a 20-year program of research and teaching involving African American adolescents and adults in several San Francisco Bay Area communities, many of which you can gather if you sort of look at the credentials that were mentioned, or if you look at the credentials anywhere else in terms of describing where I've been educated, et cetera, and taught. Significant attention has been paid to African American learners in the community college context. They've been key informants on some of these ideas. And what was beautiful about my experience is that people were talking the same language, though they were using different terms. So I was talking about socialization as a scholar. They're telling me about their experiences. Okay? I was talking about identity. They're talking about how they see themselves and what others say about them. So there's a convergence, a nice convergence between sort of the ivory tower, if you will, and also the on the ground, people's experiences. And I've tried to study that over the course of, again, about 20 years. My focus, obviously, is on understanding race and identity in the struggle for math literacy among African Americans and also their self-constructions. How do they see themselves? And I focus on those two identities that I mentioned earlier, African American identity, math identity, and how these get co-constructed. And one of the things I do that's very different is I haven't spent a lot of time focusing on the negative outcomes, failure, for example. I've tried to find instances of success, and they are out there. Many people don't know about them. We haven't spent a lot of time and energy looking for them, but they're out there. Successful parents, successful schools, successful children. African American children who are high achievers by all standards that we sort of tout as the objective standards for determining this, and they're doing really, really well. But their stories are often unheard. And part of what I've done in my research is to present those stories to the public, present them to other scholars, policymakers, et cetera, to make these stories known and to say that these children are not abnormal, they're not superheroes, this is just normative. So rather than saying that failure is normative, we're saying success is normative as well. Okay? So my work, because of the kind of work that I do, and again, I sound like a sociologist, it involves some historical analysis. So if I'm doing work in a particular community, it behooves me to learn about that community, the community history, and focus on a couple quick key questions. For example, what does mathematics mean in this community setting? How has that meaning evolved over time? Okay? What were the forces that shaped those meanings? So that I can understand student behavior then in the school context. Okay? What am I seeing in schools that might have something to do with where the children are coming from and what they believe and what their parents believe and what their elders believe, et cetera? And then how does that translate into the classroom? What about peers? What about the effect of peers? African American peers on African American peers. You know, how do those peer effects mitigate or foster success and failure, if you will? So it's ethnographic work, participant observation. When I was in the middle school in Oakland, California, I rode the bus with the students. I did all the things that ethnographers will do, hung out with them, hung out with the teachers to sort of get a sense of what does mathematics mean and why am I seeing what I see. Now, the theory part, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I actually have been forced as a math educator to move outside of my field, to look in places that can be informative, that can tell me how do I deal with race, how do I conceptualize race, how do I conceptualize identity, for example, in ways that speak to the experiences of the people that I know, the people that I care about, the people that I teach, the people that learn from me, that learn with me, et cetera, in ways that math educators have not been able to do. Again, the math education route, you remember the slide about how math education deals with race in a very, very static way. It identifies the categories, doesn't explain what race means, and then we have the outcomes, and they say it's attributable to race. These other theories, if you will, and they're not just theories, they actually sort of come down and are meaningful on the ground. Culture practice theory, cultural ecological theory, racial identity development theory, and critical theories of race all converge to help me tell those kind of stories that I tell. And they all serve different purposes, and I pick and choose as I need, and they come together in interesting ways. Now, here are some of the interesting research questions that I raised that are perhaps different, or maybe that you wouldn't have expected a math education talk to focus on. So the first question is very consistent with the knowledge construction theme here. What is the study of African American children the study of? Now, there's two ways we could look at this, sort of a broader conceptualization in terms of psychology, home life, family life, et cetera, and then there's the particular math ed studies. Well, the psychological question has been answered very clearly and definitively. African American scholars several years ago in a handbook of black psychology decided to do a literature review, a comprehensive literature review in the most significant journals in the field to say, when black children are studied, what is the focus of study? Anybody want to guess what the focus of study might have been? When black children are studied in the psychological literature, what is it the study of? Okay, pathologies. Anybody else? Deficits, test scores, test differences, et cetera. It's true. All those combine to say that the study of black children is how they differ from white children. Okay? That's what the literature review revealed. It's called a race comparative paradigm. Okay? The study of black children, for the most part, in the psychological literature, and this is in mainstream research literature, has been the study of how they differ from white children. Okay? So the obvious comeback both in terms of the psychological literature and the math ed literature, is what should the study of African American children be the study of, if not the comparison to white children? There's many things that we can study about African American children that should be studied that haven't been studied. And the issues of identity is one of them, specifically in math ed. As a math educator, I raised these two related questions. Why should African American children learn mathematics of all the disciplines? Why do we argue for this particular discipline here? Some might argue for workforce reasons, so we can turn out more engineers and scientists. Some might argue for participatory reasons in terms of getting more students into algebra. Some might argue for other utilitarian reasons. But there's other arguments that could be made for why these children should learn mathematics. Some of them moral, okay? Some of them for growth and development as human beings. And we can get into that if you want to in the Q&A, but there are other answers to the question beyond the utilitarian aspects of using this to satisfy some purpose, typically which is not in their best interest in all the time. Okay? And also, why should African American children learn mathematics? Okay? How do we take this broad question about mathematics and focus on these children where we give them the attention that they need in a way where we're looking at African American children as African American children, not in relation to white children or Asian children or any other group of children, but for their own needs? So how do we actually parse these questions and take them apart and focus on these children for their own needs? And also, how do they frame mathematics education and learning participation? And then what do we mean when we say that race is important, identity is important? And then, given now my role as a teacher-educator, what are the implications for teacher development and selection? So one of the things I have to grapple with is my role as a gatekeeper. So now I get to decide who becomes a teacher. And so part of my own filtering process and my gatekeeping process is, do I want these candidates or do I want these prospective teachers to teach anyone's children? Do they have the disposition in addition to the content knowledge? Do they see black children in particular ways? Do they see children in particular ways? Are they serving as missionaries who are going to rescue black children from their blackness, from their fates? What is their purpose of coming to the classroom? And I've seen the gamut, the spectrum of teachers in my short time at UIC. Many of them are sort of in the middle. They want to do the right thing. But in the extreme cases, we have seen people who don't want to teach black children, and they've framed that and presented that in particular ways. And then we see people who are at the other extreme, if you will, if I can phrase it that way, who want to go off and sort of save them again from who they are. So these are the kinds of questions that I've raised, that I've addressed, that I've written about, and if any of you are curious as to see how I argue, someone said that I tend to write in a way where it feels like I'm punching to the stomach or punching to the gut, and that might be the case, but I think it's important to raise these issues in significant ways. So I'll trace through really quickly here in the research portion of this talk, if you will, where I've written in policy context. You can sort of take a look at some of the titles here, national panels, criticizing those, asking the question, who should teach mathematics to African American children, framing participation itself as racialized forms of experiences. The last article looking at the co-construction idea of how do people bring these identities together. Framing the purpose of math education as a liberatory purpose. Now you might say, well, black children don't need to be liberated, slavery is over, et cetera, but I claim that they're still oppressed in society, and they're oppressed in math education, so there's a liberatory component to their education. There needs to be. And for us to overlook that, I think, would be very, very simplistic and incorrect. Dealing with the issue of race. The one here, I think this is in my own book here, we're producing a book, Mathematics Teaching, Learning, and Liberation in African American Context. This will be out fairly soon. I'll have a picture of that cover so you can get a sense of what that's all about, bringing together a collection of African American and other authors who are advocating for African American children. And then the article that someone mentioned earlier today about race and standardized testing. So I've tried to apply this lens of looking through the lens of race to a number of different areas. And I think I've been fairly successful, and I think I've generated some conversation, and hopefully conversation, again, that is not comfortable for people, that sort of upsets them, and that makes them want to pay attention to the issues. And so if you're curious as to how my ideas kind of crystallize and you want to sort of see this, there's two books that I could refer you to. I'm not trying to sell books or anything, but one is an earlier book, Mathematics Success and Failure Among African American Youth, and then the other is the new title, I should say, the Mathematics Teaching, Learning, and Liberation in the Lives of Black Children. That's a collection of authors across the country who are writing with that liberatory theme in mind. Okay? Now, where does the rubber actually hit the road? If we're going to be talking about issues of race, identity, racial hierarchies, etc., how does this actually come to life in real people's mathematical experiences? And some people have raised the question to me, if you give me these experiences, can we really believe what these people are saying? I'm going to let you decide. So I'll give you a couple of narratives. And again, my idea about identity is that it's constructed as a narrative, what people say. And I realize there's some difference between what people say and what they do. And people tend to look retrospectively at what happened and try to give meaning to that. But I think that's valid. That's their own truth. And I think we have to accept and deal with those truths in the way that they emerge. So I want to present as many narratives as possible. I know we have to be out by 6:30, so I'll try to go about 15 minutes and squeeze as many as I can in. I think there's probably going to be 2 or 3. And these are snapshots of individuals who I've interviewed over the course of my research. Some of the interviews have gone as long as 4 hours, in 1 or 2 settings where people do kind of a life story approach to what it means to be black, what it means to be African American, what do those labels mean, what does it mean when I go to school as an African American, what does it mean when I went to school as an African American, what does it mean for me as a mathematics learner? So from the broad to the very specific. And what I try to do in these signature narratives, as I call them, is pull out not necessarily the most compelling pieces, but the most representative pieces. And they leave people sometimes a little bit unsettled, and they're not really sure what to make of them, but I'll throw them out there at you, and you can sort of digest them and synthesize them in your own way, go back and think about them long after the talk is over, and in the Q&A we can sort of go back and rehash some of what you've seen. And again, I'm not going to do this in a way where I try to impose too much meaning. I'll try to let the narratives speak for themselves, but I realize there's a danger in that as well. So I'll share them with you, and if you have any questions, you can feel free to raise those. And if you do want to raise the question, did that person really believe what they said? We can debate about that in the Q&A. So this is Keith, and it's an African-American community college student who I interviewed a few years ago. He's 37 years old at the time. And again, we're talking about life as an African-American, what that means. We're talking about education, schooling, community, and a number of issues. And you can see how the conversation weaves in a number of the things that I talked about earlier. Racialization processes, racial identity, what it means to be black, what people have told you in terms of ascribing identities, et cetera. We'll go through a few panels so you get a sense in these snapshots of what's happening. So he grew up in Chicago, and he actually settled in the Bay Area, was going to community college at the time, was enrolled in an Algebra 1 course, the typical Algebra 1 course that you see at community colleges, and he was working as a surgical technician at the time. Okay, that's very key. He was working as a surgical technician, and he had aspirations of going on, transferring to the university. He had gone into the Navy after leaving Chicago, traveled the world a little bit, settled in Chicago, met his wife, settled in the Bay Area, met his wife, had a few children, and was enrolled at that point in an Algebra 1 course. Probably the most aggressive parent that I've ever met. When he met me, he was so fascinated by the idea that here I was an African-American teaching math, who was capable of teaching calculus and differential equations, that I was a department chair, and he wanted his sons to get to know me. So he'd literally bring his sons to the campus and say, I want you to meet Dr. Martin, this is someone you should know. These are my boys. By the way, here's their report cards. Can you analyze these for me? Can you tell me whether they should be going to Sylvan? What should I be doing? We started a Saturday Math Academy on the community college campus, and his wife became heavily involved in recruiting other children and their families to come to get the benefits, from their point of view of what we were doing for them. So very, very, very heavily involved parents, which shatters a stereotype of uninvolved black parents, for one, which was kind of a residual from this, but it also shows you how people respond to their experiences and how they frame them vis-a-vis what policy and researchers have to say. So I'll read this. Growing up in Chicago, I was taught that whites were better. And I said, by whom? By the school system itself. Whites are better. You shouldn't be where whites are at. You shouldn't be in this part of town. Whites are smarter. When I was in 3rd grade, I was actually the brightest kid in school, and that's where my knack of math came from. I actually exceeded all the math that they had there. They had nothing else for me. The children around me didn't exceed in math or do well, so I goofed off. Then when I made it to 5th grade, my mother put me in a Catholic school. I didn't have all of the distractions, and this was 1968 or 1969. The nun told me at that time that blacks should not consider professional occupations. It was my goal to become a physician, so I gave up. I just did enough to get through school. That became my goal. Physician, surgical tech, okay? We go on. I say, would you say that over the course of your life you've been treated fairly? I ask all my respondents this way so they can frame their life experiences. He says, no, it hasn't been fair. I found that as an African American, I've generally had to be sharper, quicker, and brighter. In the operating room, I tend to find that if there's a white who is not as skillful as I am in certain areas, he or she isn't picked on as much. The pressure of just being African American on top of doing your job, you have to be at times 3 or 4 times sharper than your white counterpart because they already feel you're inadequate. Okay? So he's dealing with race. He's understanding what race has meant for his life. He's creating it and understanding it, as I said, so it has meaning for him. I don't have to impose that. He's imposing it himself. Has this been lifelong? Lifelong. What about in your youth? In my youth, it was obvious in my youth. Chicago still has a label of being the most segregated city in the nation, and that's true to this day. It used to be number 3 a couple of years ago, but it's returned to the number 1 spot, a dubious distinction. The segregation was so strong you could feel it, you could taste it. As a result, you knew where your place was. Social location, identity, etc. How confident were you we're narrowing the conversation now to math? So you got the big broad picture or a glimpse of the big broad picture. How confident were you in your math ability? That was never an issue. I just never had the push. I did not apply myself because I did not have anyone behind me encouraging me. Who do you think should have been doing the pushing? Parents, community, the school. Why weren't those people pushing you? I'd say because the expectations were low, because most African American males don't come through there wanting or having a desire to pursue mathematics. I didn't have anyone around me saying, if you do math, you're going here in life. You can be a doctor if you just hang in there. Take a science class. You have potential, Keith. If you work, he was working at A&P at the time, a grocery store, trying to make money as a high school student. If you work, do you realize you won't be able to get your algebra homework done? No one took the time to say, why don't you join the math club? You know, they got a special program for African American students at Illinois Institute of Technology. Could you imagine? My whole world would be different. I wouldn't even be sitting here with you having this conversation. And we kind of finish up at least one of the finishing slides, and I've skipped over, again, several parts of the narrative. Has this differential treatment, is what I framed it as, I used a different word, but I'll just use differential treatment now, ever affected you growing up in your jobs or any educational situations? I felt the struggle at one time, but what I began to find out through the years of working and exposure is that whites are not smarter than me. We've never had the opportunity exposure that whites have. For example, my children sleep, eat, and drink education. My wife is at home specifically for the raising of the children. We could live a much more affluent lifestyle, but that's not the issue for us. It's education. My children are exposed to things. My wife takes them to the Lawrence Hall of Science, which is a big science museum in the hills of Berkeley, so my son can see how math relates to what he's doing right now. The point I'm making is that when you're exposed to things early on and you have role models and this is just banged into your head early on, you turn out to be a completely different kind of person. I think that's an identity issue, how you see yourself. I honestly feel that through my struggles in working and living as long as I have so far, that math is an essential foundation for everything. Okay, so you can see the interesting convergence here of issues of race, identity, racialization, the meanings that these things have, and also how he situates math within the context of his overall life experience. So all that sort of, ethereal theory that I gave you in the beginning, it begins to make sense now when you sort of have these two converge. What we think of conceptually and how we need to rethink math learning and participation and how that juxtaposes and jives with people's real experiences, specifically when we raised issues like race and identity for these social categories and groups that we create. So that's Keith. Okay, Raheem, and some of you have seen this before, the scholars in the room, the math ed scholars have seen this, but these are signature narratives, and I like to bring them out as much as I can, although this may be the retirement of Raheem after today. So Raheem was from the Bay Area, San Francisco town about 10 minutes north of Berkeley called Richmond, the Kaiser shipyards, et cetera, where African-American families settled, and was a tough part of town when those jobs, the Rust Belt was created, et cetera, left the community in a bit of devastation. It was sort of slowly emerging, et cetera, but he grew up in a time and an era where, again, meanings for what it meant to be African-American were very, very salient. And how he internalized that and what he did at this particular point in his life. He was also about 37 when I interviewed him. You'll get a glimpse of this. I grew up in North Richmond. I'm not sure if you're familiar with North Richmond. It is considered the most depressed area in the city of Richmond. When I went to the elementary school in the neighborhood as well, I didn't see black people in positions of power, authority, I grew up seeing the Brady Bunch on television, Leave It to Beaver on television, Happy Days, The Partridge Family. So I grew up looking at the images of families that were pretty much intact and had more going on for them than I saw in my community. So that was sort of like my contrast there. Seeing that, I'd be honest, I used to think that white people just naturally had it better than we did, and that was the way it was meant to be. But I have to admit, getting some factual things about black history has demonstrated to me that we did accomplish things that we weren't always in the condition we were in, where we were slaves. Now we're sort of like growing up in communities that are plagued with all types of problems, but for the first time I started seeing that there was a different side to being black. Now what I didn't say was he grew up in the community, he attended high school in the community, he came to the community college where I taught. I wasn't in his instructor because we were about the same age at the time when I interviewed him, so I couldn't have been his instructor. So he went away to UCLA, got his degree in history. Along the way, he passed the CBEST. He was a substitute teacher in LA, got a sense of what the school system was like, came back to the Bay Area, settled down, became a community activist, got married, had a small child who at the time was about a year or two old here, worked as a fireman, made a run for the school board at a very young age, and at the time, he was enrolled in a teaching credential program at one of the universities in the Bay Area, working to become a math teacher. Okay? So this is his framing of his life early. He says, and I guess getting away, he says, I tell you, man, it blew me away. I mean, until this day, it's given me a confidence that I know a lot of brothers and sisters that I deal with don't have. So, I'm thankful that I got that information at a young age and didn't grow up thinking the way I was thinking. I'll be honest, I thought that black people were inferior and white people were superior because of what I saw in the world around me. And then also, as a child growing up, I can count on just about one hand the black teachers that I had. I look back and reflect on the way I thought and the way I perceived things. That had an impact on the way I felt about my own people. I saw people that were not black as my teachers. So that made me self-consciously come on with the thought that black people are just not that smart. White people are smarter than us. That's why most of my teachers are white. Okay? Now, you may not agree with that sentiment, but those are his real experiences. Now we're getting closer to his mathematics socialization and his mathematics identity formation at a particular point in his life. He says, I always liked math. I was in third grade class, and I was running circles around the other students in math. I was just taking tests and getting A's like it wasn't nothing. I was in a math class, a regular math class in the 7th grade, and I got a B the first quarter and all A's the other 3 quarters in math. And not only that, but whenever Mrs. Burks asked a question in the classroom, my hand was usually the first hand to go up, and it was so obvious that Mrs. Burks would call the other students first to give them a chance to answer. If they didn't get it, then she would come to me and let me give the correct answer. And the only other student in the classroom whom I thought of was Bruce. He was a white student, and he wore braces, and he got an A all 4 quarters. But Bruce hardly ever answered questions. Even if he did answer questions, he never beat me with raising my hand. Part of it was I was always very competitive, so I liked to show what I could do. So anyway, I remember Mrs. Burks at the end of the school year telling me that she made a mistake not putting me in the algebra class in 8th grade. And I remember her telling me this and not realizing what algebra was, and I was just, oh well, no big deal to me. Okay, now this is a 37-year-old man reflecting on his 7th and 8th grade experiences. And this is interesting in terms of what happens and how he takes that experience, takes it up, and what he does in terms of his own agency. And he's recalling what happened to Bruce. But she put Bruce in algebra. I remember she said she should have put me in algebra also. I thought she was saying that because I used to raise my hand all the time and because I got the A's the rest of the 3 quarters. But the first time I really found out why she made that decision was when I requested my school records this past summer. When I requested my school records, I found out that in the 7th grade, I scored in the 90th percentile for mathematics. And this is the 7th grade. So when Mrs. Burks, as a teacher, should have seen this. And when I read that and saw that I got in the 90th percentile, I was angry. I was like, man, I should have been further. I should have been pushed further along in math than I was. And I tell you, man, no in hell should I have been put in a regular math class. But anyway, that's to me an example of the fact that black children, even when you do well, your educational future is not planned out properly for you. When I took math in the 8th grade because it was a regular math class, I got all B's that year. And part of the reason why I got all B's, I was bored as hell in that class. It was the first time I ever remember hating math. I mean, it was a pain to sit there through that. Not only was it the same work that I did already and knew how to do, the teacher didn't do much for me. I can't remember his name, but I do know he was a white male, and me and him, I don't really recall hitting it off, and he didn't give me any interest in math. But by the time I got to algebra in the 9th grade, I had kind of lost interest in math. Okay? Now, that's about identity. If nobody recognizes it, that's about identity and socialization. And you say, well, how many times does this really happen to black children? I would make the argument that this happens to a lot of children, black children in particular. Okay? Controversial or not, I would go on record and say that that's what I believe, and I think that that is the case. And it's not to point fingers at particular teachers like Mrs. Burks, but again, this is part of sort of a systemic, structural issue as well, not just about individuals. And the thing that I say is that I'm not on a hunt for racist individuals. My counter to that is take all the racist individual people, this is not about, black, white, take all those racist individuals, whoever they are, throw them in the ocean, get rid of them. Racism still exists. Okay? It will exist regardless of the individuals that we think of as the people perpetuating this. It's about structural, institutional, ideological machinery that continues to operate. Because what will remain, although the racist will remain, those social categories won't disappear. So we'll always give meaning to whiteness, we'll always give meaning to blackness, we'll always give meaning to other, and that will stratify us in particular ways where race is recreated, reconstructed, reconfigured to match the geopolitical and social political context. Now, he's going to be a math teacher, so he goes on to reflect on the teaching profession and how people become teachers, which is why the question of who gets to become a teacher matters. So I take my gatekeeper role very, very seriously in terms of addressing that issue. So that's why I decided to become a teacher, because I want to help, too, with that perception in other children's minds that black people are not intelligent. They're not capable. Their advice and suggestions are not valid. But if I demonstrate to children that a black person is intelligent and they know what they're talking about, that will help them have a more confidence in themselves and their own people. During segregation, the teachers who worked in segregated schools didn't have to have any particular credentials to be a teacher. But now today, in order to be a public teacher, you have to have a bachelor's, you have to pass the CBEST, you have to get through a credential program, and you have to pass the MSAT. If you don't pass those necessary classes as an undergraduate, but those requirements doesn't necessarily mean you're a good teacher. I think this is a challenge specifically to this idea of a highly qualified teacher. Degree and certification doesn't mean that you're capable of teaching all children. It just doesn't work that way. So again, their language and our language as scholars and people who do this kind of thing in the ivory tower sometimes may not look the same, but if you look for deeper meaning, you'll see that real people are saying things that match up to what some of us are onto at this point. But one thing it's saying to me and other black people that unless we get through these requirements, we're not qualified to teach our children. And it's also saying to us we're going to put up standards that keep you from teaching your children. Even though it's having that adverse effect on the education of your children, we're still going to leave it in place. So it's telling me that the educational system don't give a damn about black children because it's allowing the system to perpetuate itself. That's causing this demise of our children in the educational system. Okay? Whether you buy it or not, this is his truth. I'm going to squeeze in one shorter narrative, and I think we'll still have about 15 minutes. I know we're supposed to be out. And these are shorter. This is Raquel, because I wanted to diversify the gender response here, so I'll give you a shorter narrative from Raquel, and I think this is pretty much self-contained. It gives you a glimpse into her thinking. Again, a 30-something-year-old African-American at the community college coming back for her own educational reasons, and she's reflecting on her mathematical experiences, in this case with a particular teacher at a particular point in her life. I was in high school, it was in the 9th grade, and I had a teacher, I'll never forget his name, I'll never forget him. I had a C in algebra, this is the first semester, and I had a D the second, and he told me, this is as far as you can go in math. I never took another math class from that point on until I came to Cal State Hayward. She subsequently went on to get a degree in social sciences because she wanted to avoid math in all the other majors. And you bought into it. Why wouldn't I? I'm a 15-year-old black student, and my teacher's, whatever race he is, white male, he's telling me, this is it, you've gone as far as you can go. He didn't have any patience. It wasn't like maybe you need to look into another class, maybe another teacher, maybe another method of instruction. Math wasn't stressed. It just wasn't. Okay? So I could go on all day with these kinds of narratives, but I want to skip through here and in there and leave some time for questioning. But I hope that the points that I've made that sort of hopefully fit in with the overall theme of the series of talks around knowledge construction resonate with some of you, and that the first part of the talk where it seemed to be again a little bit ethereal and conceptual did make sense, more sense when we got to the narratives. And the points that I make about race and identity, I think these are essentially important, but as I said, unfortunately, they're very, very poorly studied among math educators, and they're very, very poorly put forward by policymakers as well, even when they try to hint at some of these issues in what they think is the best interest of children. By talking about race and racial achievement gaps, et cetera. We know that there's good intentions there, but those good intentions are also fueled by very, very negative framings of the children themselves. And to ask teachers and administrators and community members and policymakers to respond to that is very, very problematic. You're starting at the wrong point. And as you all know, as some of you in the room, mathematics problem solving is composed of two parts: problem posing and problem solving. You pose the problem in an ill-structured way, your solution is probably not going to be the appropriate one. So I'll end there and thank you again for your attention, and hopefully we can have a little bit of dialogue.
Hi, my name is Deb Smith.
Yes.
I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Several years ago, I used to mentor in the school system here at Portland State at Harriet Tubman, and I was frustrated by the fact that a lot of the educators insisted on the kids using calculators for basic math.
Mm-hmm.
When I took my third year of calculus at a community college, I had a professor who hated calculators.
Mm-hmm.
He believed they weren't a teaching tool, and I'd like to get your opinion on that, because I had wasn't an argument, but a debate with one instructor whose reasoning was that the kids didn't know how to do the math, so that's why she had calculators in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Interesting question. I don't have a complete answer to that. It's a debate that's going to rage probably, forever in terms of student skills, But But I would say two things in response to that. One, I think I may have said at some point in the discussions in the last 2 days, diversity of students necessitates diversity of need. So some students, given where they are, in terms of their trajectory, their prior instruction, et cetera, prior learning, may need a calculator in the moment. Okay? That should be coupled with other things that they also need so that they don't have to depend on that calculator forever. I don't think there's any one approach. I mean, students need to certainly unburden themselves with, some of the more routine, if you will, and get on to some of the deeper and conceptual stuff. But I think it's a combination of the two. So students who need to learn the basics should learn the basics in, I guess, the old-fashioned ways, if you will. They should be able to use technology if that's what it takes, but they should also be expected to explain both of those. Why do you do this the standard way? Why do you think the calculator produces this kind of answer? I mean, I think there's ways to harness and manage whatever tools that we give to students. And we also have to understand what those tools mean to the students themselves. Is a calculator from the student point of view really a crutch? Or is it that the teacher is just saying that and the teacher doesn't necessarily want to instruct in another way? I mean, so we can look at it from multiple vantage points and we can critique and debate, et cetera, but I don't have a definitive answer on that. It's not to sit on the fence, but I think, again, diversity of needs, is necessitated the diversity of students that we have. And some students will need it at some point. Hopefully they won't need it forever. Okay. Sure.
Hi, thank you. I really
Sure.
enjoyed your speech.
Thank you.
I noticed in 2 of your narratives
Yes.
that the first 2 men
Yes.
talked about how they were really great in 3rd grade,
Mm-hmm.
and then their problem started in junior high, and the woman's problem started in 9th grade.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if in your research you found that there's something about algebra, or maybe the concept that some people have that algebra doesn't have really practical applications, and how that fit into your research?
Well, my students, the students that were in my studies, they didn't focus necessarily on algebra as a particular point of departure out of the math pipeline or identify algebra as particularly difficult. And for me, it's not if you're honest, it's not a matter of subject matter for me. So one of the reasons why I don't talk about how black students learn algebra, how black students or African American students learn arithmetic, is because that's not a question that I think is, a real, it's important, but it may not be the only question that we need to raise. So I never focus on whether or not black children can learn algebra, for example. I know that they can. A normal, healthy African American child who's given access to the kind of resources that they need will perform. I think there's a number of structural and other kinds of barriers that are often put in place that mask their performance. So whether it's algebra, whether it's calculus, whether it's beginning arithmetic, those are not the kinds of questions that I'm overly concerned with because I have faith and confidence in these children. Having said that, I think these kinds of analysis, which are sort of on one hand macro, they sort of consider the larger real world forces, but they also bring it down to the individual. I think those kinds of studies need to be complemented by the kinds of studies that I just criticized, that tell us how do black students engage in contexts predominated by algebra, so that we at least know, so that we're not left to assume. And we do this in ways where we're not generalizing from a few to many, which I may be accused of here. So it would be nice if we had studies of black students in different kinds of contexts, learning algebra, so that we know, or we could confirm that black students can learn algebra like anybody else, right? And there may be some cultural affordances, or there may be some cultural considerations that we may need to inform teachers about, not in an essentialistic way that just because you're black you have to do it this way. But I think those two kinds of analyses are important. I do the one kind of analysis, but I would like to see other people do the other type. So anyone that does have an interest in focusing on algebra as a particular point of departure, certainly I think those studies are welcomed. I don't think there's anything about algebra that black children can't do or black learners can't do. I think there's something about algebra in the school context that prevents them from demonstrating their skills and abilities.
Hi, I'm Catrice Lane. I'm an educator in mathematics at Rosemary Anderson High School, first year teaching, and prior to that I was an engineer. I was personally drawn to your narrative pertaining to the identity of teachers in the classroom and how Raheem, I believe, was not familiar or never seen an African American teacher in the classroom. As an African American teacher, I see that even more, and that was one of the reasons why I was drawn to teach mathematics. Having said that, I wanted to pose the question, do you feel like the management of African American youth is not something that other non-African American teachers have the ability, or I shouldn't say have the ability, but if they have the right tools or techniques so that they can better teach our youth and better manage our youth? Do you feel like there's a gap in that instant?
Right. We could problematize the manage phrase, if you will, but I'm going to overlook that just for now, and maybe we can talk about it after the fact. But the second paper on this list raises, in some people's minds, that very question, because the assumption going in, if you read the title alone, I assumed and I knew that the assumption would be, well, gee, he's going to make an argument that black teachers should teach black children, that white teachers should not teach black children. Here's my response. There are some black teachers who I don't want teaching anybody's children, right? There are some white teachers who I will run a mile for to put them in front of these children. So for me, it's more than the content knowledge, it's more than the pedagogical content knowledge. What I identify in this paper are things like your racial competence, your ability to understand and connect with the children. The people who can do that best are the ones I think should be afforded the opportunity to teach black children. So in Chicago, for example, as big as it is, we know that there are leadership issues, there are instructional issues, and those leadership issues and instructional issues don't escape black administrators and black teachers. And there are some black teachers, as I said, and other teachers as well, who shouldn't be teaching anyone's children. And if I can, have a role in, getting them out of the profession, counseling them out, or, trying to help them redo their practice, so be it. But if it's, looking at the binary here, just sort of polarization of black, white teacher, I want the best teachers. However the community and the children, in terms of their responses, indicate that best is really appropriate, those are the teachers I want. So they don't have to be racially specific, no. But I get that question all the time. Just because I generate the questions that I do in provocative ways, people think they know the answers, and they have to sort of read and understand my message before they really get to my sense of what the answer really might be about.
I think we have time for one more.
Yep.
Something kind of confused me about the first part of your presentation.
Sure.
You said that, if I recall correctly, that if when we have, like, for example, reports or studies that say things like African American students are more likely to be mathematically illiterate, that reinforces the idea that African Americans are not able to do math, or that they are inherently mathematically illiterate. So if you have a study that shows some disparity, that a larger percentage of African American students are failing their math classes, for example, like what do you do with that information, and how do you present it? Or is the problem with the study itself? Like, should you not conduct studies that compare students by race? Like, how do you use that information?
I get that question a lot of time as well, and I don't want anyone to leave thinking that I'm downplaying the importance of knowing about these score differences, if you will. I think the score differences are important. A couple things to keep in mind. We could literally manufacture the difference that goes the other way overnight, and I was talking about this. We could change tests. So these differences are partially socially constructed. We could change the test items, and we could change the nature of tests to reverse the gap, if you will, put black students on top. That's the first thing. The second thing is, given that the numbers have meaning, the differences have meaning, where I particularly object, this is just one of my objections, I object to white students becoming the barometer for black students. We talked about this earlier, where it's really mean versus mean. So we're talking collective score of white students versus collective score of black students. It's mean versus mean, average versus average. If the goal for black children is the average for white children, I think that's an artificially low standard. Okay? What the standard should be for black children should not be the scores of white children, which we can, deconstruct, et cetera. It should be what some scholars, African American scholars, say is excellence. Why not have black children become excellent students as opposed to having black children become like white students, right? Why make that the barometer? Why can't we sort of leave the racial garbage out of the equation and allow black students to demonstrate what we knew they could do all along? Right? The barometer should never be white children. We can certainly use those differences to say that there's something going on in the educative and the schooling process, but at the end of the day, it should not be to raise black children to the level of white children. It should be to take black children to wherever they need to go to be successful and to navigate the society. And if we only set the standard at the level where white children are, black children will always be behind, right? And the other example that I gave is what happens, let's take it to its logical end. I'm repeating a lot what I said earlier, and I guess that's where I was really the bomb, but what happens when black children outperform white children? Okay, what do we do then? And I don't know if we have any domestic cases, but one of the international cases is, you know what happens, right? So, anybody know, except for the people that were in the room? Right? There's a very famous example of when black children outperformed white children on a very valorized test of assessment. Yeah. Well, they changed the test. They changed the test. So these differences are important, but they're also socially constructed, one, right? The barometer is, a barometer that we probably shouldn't have. And it also does a very insidious thing, and I'll leave on this, is that it tells black children about their identity. It tells white children about their identity. It's telling black children that you are inferior, and it's also, in an indirect way, telling white children something about themselves, and it's also informing white children about black children. And I think that is particularly insidious. And that translates to school-related actions where you have administrators saying, you have districts opening offices, et cetera, where now the mantra is we need to close the achievement gap, right? The racial achievement gap. If those are your marching orders and everything that you do is based on that sort of initial assumption about those two groups of students and all the students in the hierarchy in between, it doesn't matter what you do after that point, you're bound to fail, which is why we see the same discussions this year that we saw 15 years ago, what we saw 20 years ago, et cetera. Right? It's based on this idea that somehow black children are change-worthy and that they need to be someone or something else in order to be high achievers or good students, okay? Or to gain access to algebra or to become engineers and scientists. It's never for their best interest, it's always in someone else's best interest, right? The reason we want more engineers and scientists is not for the betterment of the black community, it's so that the U.S. maintains its international competitiveness, right? So that's not a moral compunction, that's a very, very self-serving mode for giving salience to algebra and sort of propping algebra up so that we can create a pool of workers who will carry out a mission for the U.S., right, in the global context. Right? That's not about furthering the lives and bettering the lives of black children. Imagine the black children were the top achievers tomorrow. We're not going to utilize all their skills and talents anyway. There's no way if black children became the best students in the state of California, for example, that the UC system would open its gates to all the qualified black students. There'd be some kind of political maneuvering where we sort of reshuffle the hierarchy so that the haves continue to have and the have-nots get a little bit more, but not as much as the haves want them to get, don't want them to get. Okay, so we'll continue to recreate this, this thing that we call race over and over and over and over. It's never going to go away. There'll be some way. So test scores are not going to change anything. It'll make us applaud for the moment and say, yeah, black students are doing really, really well, but then you look at the life outcomes and the circumstances of many of those same children, they're still going to face racism, they're still going to face bias and discrimination, and it's not going away anytime soon. So on that cheery note, thank you.
But